Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Tina Vung, and I am the Capability Building Coordinator for Connecting Up and TechSoup New Zealand. I'd like to welcome you all today to the webinar Cyber Hackers Don't Discriminate, which will be presented by Monica Schlesinger from Advisory Boards Group. We'll start with a bit of housekeeping. All lines are muted, so if you have any questions during the session, please type it in the questions box on your webinar panel, and Monica will answer these questions throughout and at the end of the webinar. Please note that your comments and questions will not appear to the entire group. If you have any technical issues, please also type it in the questions box, and I'll try my best to help you out with that. Please note that if you are on a Wi-Fi connection and have multiple programs open, this can sometimes affect the quality of the audio and video of the webinar. If possible, please close all other programs to help you have the best experience possible today. Before we start, I'd also like to remind you that the webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to you all within 2 to 3 business days of the webinar ending. You'll be able to access it at any given time after this. That's all from me for now. I'll pass it over to Monica to get things started.
Thank you, Tina, and good morning, everybody. I will give you a very short introduction about myself. I used to be, this is over 30 years ago, I used to be an IT architect and systems integrator, and I worked with all the major brands of Unix and also Windows NT. Later on, I moved in my career in project management, and I actually managed a few cybersecurity projects at that time. The word cyber was introduced only later, so we are talking about security, which was very, very different from what it is now. What prompted me, however, to move about 3-4 years ago into cybersecurity was an incident or a near incident that we had with one of our other companies. So we have a company that is creating apps, is-based publishing, and these are all apps for children, so in the education space. One day we saw an unauthorized access to one of our mobile dev accounts from the Netherlands. And Netherlands is actually known as a massive group, has a massive group of hackers. So in the next 2 hours after we noticed this, we really didn't know what we were dealing with. Of course, we didn't, and this is one piece of advice that I would like to give everyone. If you realize or you think that you are hacked, don't shut your computer down. Simply disconnect it from the network, because sometimes these viruses or malware can actually be resident only in memory. So for the next 2 hours, we did the forensics and we investigated why and how and what happened. We realized that it was actually an authorized access because we are giving the statistics to another company for our apps. However, that really changed my professional life, and it made me think very, very differently. And one of the things that I think is really, really important to understand is that no matter how big or small you are actually a target for the hackers. And throughout this presentation today, I will talk about the 3 main drivers in the cybersecurity industry, and I will come back to these drivers because it is really important to understand why the industry is growing. The first one is the fact that the hackers are actually finding this as a very easy way of making money without having a lot of computer knowledge. The second driver that makes the industry grow is the regulatory environment that is getting tighter and tighter for organizations. And the third one, which we'll probably see more and more in Australia, because it is happening in the US at the moment quite a lot, are the class actions. So the lawyers actually suing the companies that were breached on behalf of the users. So going to the topics for discussion, I want to talk a bit about the cyber attacks 101. Are the not-for-profits targeted by cyber attacks? Whether you are prepared or you think you're prepared for an attack, and we will end with a survey and prize. So the people who will fill in the survey, one of them will be the lucky winner and will have a 30-minute conversation with me over the phone about their issues and how to best deal with them. So Cyber Attacks 101, we will be covering Australia and New Zealand, given that some of the Connecting Up clients are also from New Zealand. So if we talk about the entire web, we call it the World Wide Web. I brought here a picture which is not quite to scale, because the first part that you see, it's almost like an iceberg, but the first part that you see above the water in reality represents only 4%. So the drawing is actually too big. So the 4% of the World Wide Web is the discoverable part. So it's everything that you can type in a browser. You can say www.something and you can get to a website. When you create a website, obviously the server has an IP address, and then you connect that to the name, which is done through the domain name service. You have to register your website with the crawlers or the robots to make it discoverable. Underneath this surface, there is the deep web. So over 90% of what is in the information is actually underneath the surface, and you can't discover it. And you can't go to those websites unless you know the IP address. The World Wide Web, the discoverable part, and the deep web, as you know them, can be accessed through the normal browsers. There's a part, however, which is we call the dark web, which can't be accessed through the normal browsers. And this is where the bad guys, the criminals, really go and buy malware. They trade guns, they trade, they do pornography, they actually buy various viruses, and that's from where they mount the attacks. So this dark web can only be accessed through a peer-to-peer method. In other words, from a computer, you can go to another router, and it's done through very different methods than the ones that we use in our normal professional life. I'll give you a minute to read about the cyber attacks that are happening. So when we talk about the identity theft, this is one of the fastest growing crimes, not only in US, but in the UK and in Australia as well. When thieves are actually getting your ID, they can go and impersonate you in various situations, from stealing your credit card details, or in the US, it's quite common to access medical services under someone's ID. And this is a problem because it takes about 2 years to actually clear your credentials, and there are special companies that can help you do that. Your credit rating is obviously affected when your ID was stolen. By 2020, more than a quarter of the attacks will actually be in the IoT. So when I speak about the Internet of Things, I mean any sort of device that can actually connect to internet. And you can think of cameras, you can think of all these wonderful devices that will be for sale, like microwaves and fridges, and anything that is connected to internet can be hacked. The cars have a computer, and there were cars that were hacked and can be hacked. And worse, actually, there are industrial devices that can be hacked. And there was a significant case in Iran when a nuclear plant was actually attacked through these devices. So all these IoT devices were not built with security in mind. there's a significant effort now to upgrade them. Some of them can't be upgraded, and only the new ones will be able to be more secure. And all this crime affects us in various ways. The ransomware attacks are the attacks whereby a hacker comes and locks your computer and demands a ransom. And we will talk a bit later about an example which Tina already presented. I'm bringing you now to the second driver in the cybersecurity industry, which is the regulatory environment. The Privacy Act in Australia was amended on the 22nd of February 2018 when a data breach notification scheme, a mandatory data breach notification scheme, came into effect. What does that mean? It means that all the companies that are subject to the Privacy Act must report if they have a breach. So these are agencies, most government agencies, organizations whose turnover is greater than 3 million, and some that are in the health services industry, entities trading in personal data, and this is regardless of the revenue they have. This list is correlated obviously with the condition of qualifying that the data breach can lead to a serious harm for the individuals whose data was stolen. However, I will discuss a bit later about the serious harm, which is actually not defined and is quite difficult to assess how serious the harm is. If we look across the Tasman in New Zealand, the Privacy Act from '93 does not have a provision as yet for mandatory reporting. However, this is likely to change in the future. So there were other countries that had mandatory data breach notification before Australia, and Australia adopted this measure now. And the government has indicated in New Zealand that a mandatory requirement is actually going to be part of the new legislation. One of the important points that I want to make is that if you have, regardless of where you are, if you have your data in the cloud with a hosting provider and the backup for that data is in a different country, if the data is breached, that may be subject to the laws, to the privacy laws in that particular country. So because of that, you actually have to think that you may need to report it depending on where your data resides. A very simple view of the Privacy Act shows the APPs, the Australian Privacy Principles. And when we talk about cyber, we have to think of APP1, Open and Transparent Management of Personal Information. We think of APP8, Cross-Border Disclosure of Personal Information. And the most important one is the Security of Personal Information, APP11. I will take you now to the privacy principles in New Zealand. And the New Zealand privacy principle number 5, the safeguards to prevent loss, misuse, and disclosure of data, is actually significant and must be respected. The loss, misuse, or disclosure doesn't necessarily have to be connected to cyber attacks, but also to the processes that that are instated in each organization. Now, I would like you to think of the best practice and really ask yourselves, if you're not private, you're not subject to the Privacy Act, should you really say, well, we don't need to worry about this because we are not subject to the Privacy Act. We don't need to report any breach and so on. What we have seen internationally in the US, and even the massive case that happened in Iran with this nuclear plant, was that a larger company was actually targeted through a contractor, through a smaller company, because larger companies have bigger budgets, they have teams in place, they are already used to attacks because they have a bigger presence, and they are better prepared and in a position to withstand an attack. However, the hackers know only very well that if they attack a smaller company, they can actually find a very easy door, a backdoor into the larger companies through these organizations. So, given what is happening at the moment, I'm actually advising people to upgrade their processes and their measures and consider and behave as if they are subject to the Privacy Act. Because the better prepared you are, the more resilient you will become to cyber attacks. And this will actually ensure the stability and longevity of your company. One of the statistics given by the Ponemon Institute in Australia, and which was published by the government, was that about 60% of the small to medium companies that suffer an attack will be out of business within 6 months of being hacked. And I will just give one example. This happened in 2011. A company called discriminate. It was a hosting company and a domain name provider, was hacked, and within the space of 2 weeks, they simply had to shut the company down. So what happened, a hacker from the back of New South Wales who couldn't find employment in the IT industry simply made a list of companies that he wanted to hack and started with discriminate. By gaining access to one of the 2 computers that were internal to the company, so of the IT security expert, they actually managed to bring the servers down, and despite all the efforts of the team to bring them up again, of course the hacker was exactly in their midst, so he brought them down again. It didn't take longer than probably a week for the authorities to find out and to come knocking at their door. And the clients left within 3 days. In our days, the clients will actually leave a company that was attacked within 1 day. And then it was all over the news and they had to sell their assets. So this was really a terrible example, but it can happen to anyone. One would ask the question, are the NFPs targeted by cyber attacks? And this is a sort of statistic from 2016-17, which shows just how many NFPs are there. I believe in Australia there are more than 56,000. So you have to think how many of these companies are really prepared to withstand an attack, and are they really targeted? Last year, the Australian Minister, Marise Payne, the Defence Minister, stated that over 400 companies were hacked by Russian state-sponsored attacks. So this was very much in response, and everybody can remember the MH17 attack that killed Australians. So the plane was actually shot by Russia. Australia wants to bring Russia to justice. And this was a reaction. The same thing happened in New Zealand when General Hampton blamed Russia for 122 incidents. So the state-sponsored attacks have massive funding behind them, and they are really, really difficult to withstand. The simple hackers, and there are probably at the moment about 100,000 of them in the world, have different motivations. So the motivation is merely, to get money. They can buy these tools from the dark web, and there is what is important is the ease of mounting the attacks. If the state-sponsored attacks are actually motivated either by revenge for a particular measure that was taken by the government, or to simply steal intellectual property, because it is cheaper to actually fund a cyber attack than to fund research. The hackers come back to the money, so they simply want to make money. And one of my questions is, what about the stakeholders? If you try to put yourselves in the shoes of your users, of your clients, of your patients, what would they think if you suffer a cyber attack, if their data is stolen, is sold or exposed on various dark websites, and they find out that actually your organization didn't have any measures in place? Would you stay with that company? And a few more examples. In 2017, there was a cyber attack that exposed personal information of 8,000 clients of family planning. In 2015, in the US, the hackers obtained the info about 700,000 not-for-profits. And the very well-publicized case in 2016 of the Australian Red Cross personal data breach. This was not a cyber attack with the Australian Red Cross. It was simply a mistake made by one of their providers, a contractor, that placed the entire database of donors on an unprotected part of their website. This was discovered by somebody in the Netherlands, somebody who was, let's say, a white hat hacker or gray hat. We call black hat hackers somebody who is really bad and is a criminal. White is an ethical hacker who is actually helping you become cyber resilient. So there were, I believe, 3 downloads of the database, and this was corrected immediately. The person from the Netherlands communicated with the authorities in Australia with CERT, and the database was immediately deleted. From then on, Red Cross had a very swift response, which is now given as and shown as best practice, because they contacted all their donors. They explained very openly what happened. They apologized, and they took immediate measures to prevent any further incident. And this was really good, because the donors didn't leave the organization. It would have been a massive disaster if that would have happened. The OAC had their report in which they made only 2 recommendations, and one was about having a condition in all the contracts with their providers or third parties to stipulate how they will cooperate or behave when there is a breach. It doesn't matter on which side the breach happens. And the other one was about purging their database. So in other words, you have to think that if you have obsolete records that you no longer need to keep, you need to look every now and then and go through an exercise of purging them. Our webinar today had the title Cyber Hackers Don't Discriminate. So up until now, we spoke about targeted attacks. However, last year, the WannaCry attack did not discriminate. And I will explain how this happened. Microsoft is actually publishing their patches on a monthly basis. There is like the Tuesday patches, that's how they are called, and they published the patches in March. Now, the companies, the organizations that did not apply the patch, did not upgrade their computers, were actually targeted through a scanning exercise, scanning of the internet for computers that were vulnerable. Most of these computers were running Windows 7 or versions of Windows that were not even supported. So the way it happened, the computers were locked, and a message for demanding a ransom of between $300 to $600 appeared on the screen, and that was payable in Bitcoin. By the way, just to give you an example, in the US, the medium to large companies actually have keep Bitcoin just in case they suffer an attack and they want to go back really quickly. The attack was not well executed from the hackers' perspective, because they only made 130,000, which is not a lot. Their attack happened between April and May, so about a month to 2 months later after the patch was released by Microsoft. However, the impact on the companies that were hit was much larger than that. It was about $4 billion. One of the well-publicized organizations that was hit by WannaCry was NHS, the National Health Service in the UK, where I believe some of the clinics and hospitals were actually brought to a standstill because the records were all online. So if you think that more and more some of the attacks, and in particular these sort of low-level attackers, the script kiddies, are performing these scanning exercise on internet, looking for vulnerabilities, you have to think that you need to put in place measures that will protect your organization. The size of the organization doesn't matter. The brand doesn't matter. For the hackers, it only matters to find the computers that were not patched, the routers that were not patched. And we always think of having multiple layers of protection because the hackers only need to break through once, and they will actually manage to do damage. If we think about the ways that you can prepare for a cyber attack, very many cyber attacks can actually be so huge that they almost paralyze organizations. Theft of data, millions of records were stolen. In the US, there were some significant breaches. Target, Home Depot, another company that was hacked was Anthem, and they lost millions of dollars, and they lost business, they lost clients. So sometimes the attack can be so significant that no matter what measure you take, you can't defend yourself against it. However, what is really, really important is that you have taken, prior to any attack, that you have taken the measures, that you have put in place the measures and the governance to be prepared for this, to help the company recover after an attack. And when I talk about the measures, you need to start at the board level, because the risks that a company faces are so significant. The risk of going under, that is a risk that actually sits with the directors of the company, with the board of directors. That's where the conversation has to start. Many people that I talk to, they believe at the board level, CEOs, they think that this is an IT matter only. It's not an IT matter only if the organization can simply go under following a cyber attack. And one of the organizations, an international organization that actually recommends that you treat the cyber risk very, very differently than all the other risks is IOSCO. So this is the International Organization of Security Agencies, of which ASIC is the only Australian member. And they recommend to treat cyber as the most important risk for the organization. So it doesn't mean that you have to treat the cyber risk separate from the risk management system you have in place, but treat it as an extreme risk that is being discussed at the board level. And as a director on a number of boards and for so many years, I always behaved at the board level, according to our principle, nose in, hands out. So at the board level, we talk about strategy, we implement strategy, but we don't mix into the operational things, into the operational stuff. So at board level, you should have a cybersecurity strategy. The board of directors has to educate itself in the measures they can take in the danger that can face the organization, and they have to implement this cybersecurity strategy. Our company, the Advisory Boards Group, offers a board level education course, cybersecurity for directors and officers, a half-a-day workshop, which actually is very hands-on, and the participants will write the cybersecurity strategy on a page that can help the directors then task the CEO and the management with the plans that need to be done at management level within the organization so that the company is protected. The board also needs to authorize the resources and the funds to protect the organization. Another measure that we believe is really important is that you actually have a health check or an audit of your cybersecurity governance. So this doesn't necessarily mean, asking the IT person to look at what viruses or what antiviruses software packages you have, or IDS, IPS, intrusion detection system, intrusion protection system. You have to really assess the entire organization. So you need to look in at different areas. And this is why we recommend that you have this health check. First, try to understand where you are, and from that point onwards, define where you want to get, what your cybersecurity resilience goals are, and actually go from where you are to where you want to be. Cybersecurity will not touch only the IT, will also touch the education for employers. Cybersecurity can actually touch the HR department and require that you implement policies for hiring and firing people, confidentiality, disclosure, and so on. It will also touch the third parties' relationship with your stakeholders, and also the conditions that you have to put in your contracts with your third parties. What will happen if you get hacked? What will happen with your hosting provider, for example, if they get hacked? How will you cooperate in a situation like that? So it is really important to know. If you deal with government agencies, what are your obligations to notify them? If you're a recipient of a grant, for example, and you get hacked, how will you act in a situation like that? And all the companies that are subject to the Privacy Act and to the data breach notification scheme should actually have a data breach notification plan. Because when a cyber attack happens, things can precipitate. Everything happens so quickly that you have to have a plan in place. You need to know where you go, whom you call first, who is going to be involved, who is going to support you, who is going to do the forensics, what's going to happen with your relationship with the banks, with your stakeholders, your employees, contractors, and so on. So you have to have all these processes well defined, and actually you have to rehearse this plan at least once a year. I used to work at one point, I used to manage a large project in St. George Bank, and they had two centers. One was in Kogarah and one was in the middle of Sydney. Now this was like more than 10 kilometers apart. Once or twice a year, they had this crisis committee that was initiating an exercise of bringing one center down and bringing the other one up. So they were testing whether they can withstand an IT problem. I recommend always to our clients that they have this data breach notification plan in place, and they actually test, they do a crisis simulation at least once a year to see that they know exactly where to go and what to do in the case of a breach. Coming down from these two measures, so I said the board education and the cybersecurity strategy coming from the board, and then the health check and or audit of the organization. You need to be prepared and have a business continuity plan. And this is not only about cyber. So cyber is actually one segment, one chapter in this plan, but you need to have a business continuity plan so that you protect the organization, and also a risk management system. So one of the major functions of the directors and of the board is to manage the extreme and high risks. And you do that through a risk management system. So I see the directors being in charge of creating the risk strategy, which obviously includes the risk appetite. This strategy is actually trickles down through the layers of the organization. The risk is being managed upwards in a pyramid style, and you manage the risks at each level in conjunction with your delegated authority or delegated financial authority. And there will be risks that the CEO does not have a delegated authority or delegated financial authority, so the CEO has to bring these risks to the board. It is also important that you have on your board agenda the cybersecurity and the cybersecurity risk, because this was one of the get out of jail cards for the target directors in the US who suffered a massive attack. When the class action, through a class action, the users whose IDs were hacked, they sued the board of directors. They really got out of it by saying, look, we actually had the cybersecurity risks on our board agenda for the past 12 months. Now, I'm not saying to add the cybersecurity as a sort of fake item just to prove that the board is talking about it, but really open the conversation at the board level. And this will also give the board the possibility to understand what they are exposed to and to have meaningful conversations with the management about the measures and the plans that need to be put in place. So if we want to recap, you first need to start the conversation at the board level, ensure that your board is educated and creates a cybersecurity strategy, which is then implemented with participation within the organization, with participation from the CEO, from the management, from all the departments. The second one is to have a cybersecurity governance health check, which will show you what status the organization is in. And then you also need to define the goals. What do you want to achieve and where do you need to get to? What is important is when you suffer a cyber attack is how you're going to recover from it, and you have to know that beforehand, or you have to try as much as possible to have a plan to recover. Some of the products that we put in place and we created and fine-tuned after dealing with many boards and CEOs were actually suitable to help organizations recover or prepare from cyber attacks. We do have, I have not mentioned here, we also do have an IT team and a cybersecurity technical team that can help you create suitable solutions if you need that. But the starting point of a conversation has to be, with respect to cyber, has to be at the board level, and it must actually deal with the governance of cybersecurity. We have a newsletter, if you're interested in, which comes out on a weekly basis, and it covers regulatory changes, it covers major attacks and what is happening around the world, the legislation and so on. Now, one of the things that I have not mentioned now, and we have a few more minutes to talk about, is GDPR. So if we look around the world, most of the US states have data breach notification legislation, and Europe has implemented, as of 25th of May this year, GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. So this legislation is actually much tougher than the provisions of the Privacy Acts, both in Australia and in New Zealand. And organizations that have European clients or have links to European counterparts may need to abide by the rules of GDPR. And they are quite expensive to implement, and the fines are also really expensive. They can go in the order of, I believe, £2 million or £4 million, or 5% of the organization's total revenue per year. So this is just to bring something to your attention if you have a relationship with a European counterpart, or if you have European clients. So before I give the microphone back to Tina, I just wanted to invite people if you have any questions.
We do have a question from Michael for you, Monica. Michael has asked if you can refer them to organizations that do cyber risk assessments so that they will know if they have the capability to determine if their data was breached.
I think the answer is a bit more complex. So when you talk about risk, cyber risk, you see the risk in the context of the enterprise risk management system. If you want to look only at the cyber risk and see if your organization was hacked, obviously you want to look at a company that does cyber forensics. So I don't want to recommend a company in particular But sometimes you have to understand that the hackers can stay in your network, and I think the average dwelling time is called, we call it dwelling time, is about 180 days. So you can actually have the hackers get into your network, stay there, and try to get the information, get them more passwords, and so on. Something like that can only be noticed if you have intrusion detection systems or intrusion protection systems. So having a company coming and merely trying to analyze your traffic, so there are systems that will actually learn the normal patterns of traffic in the organization. It probably takes 2 to 3 weeks, and after that, anything that is extraneous, can be reported. So it's not really a risk assessment exercise that is quick. It can actually take time. And when you also deal with these sort of tools that are doing the risk assessment, the IDS and IPS, so intrusion detection, intrusion protection system, you have to compare specific viruses, malware, to large databases. So my advice is only that to look at very large companies that have significant databases or subscriptions to large databases of these viruses. So if you try to think in terms of, for example, like an antivirus software, an antivirus software that comes from a larger company, like Norton, McAfee, and so on, is comparing any activity or any file that it discovers against a larger database. Similarly, if you have an intrusion detection system, intrusion protection system, you have to compare it to a larger database. So I would only suggest look at larger companies. Now, with a larger company, that equates to a larger budget. So there are companies around in Australia, but I can't recommend a particular one, not knowing how much you want to invest in this, how large is your company, how sensitive is your data. So I'll just give one name. Let's say, Mimecast is a significant organization. If you have data and you keep it in the cloud, for example, Armor, which is one of our partners, is a very large company that has an intrusion detection, intrusion protection system. So I think the answer is very much resides with you, because you need to define what you need and how sensitive your data is, what would be the consequences of getting breached, and how much budget do you want to invest in this. So yeah, I'm sorry I couldn't give like a really straightforward answer, but it really depends on what you need. And what you need can actually be found out through a cyber governance health check, which will help you define all these things, all these parameters, and then it will be easier for you to construct the answer after you see and you define all these parameters.
Great. Michael says, thanks for the advice. Very insightful. So outside of that, there are no other questions. Just so everybody knows that the survey will pop up at the end when I end the session. So you'll get a pop-up box from GoToWebinar with the 10 questions. It will only take you 1 or 2 minutes to fill it out. Very straightforward. So Monica will give you the details of what the prize will be now.
So the prize will be a 30-minute conversation with myself or one of our other consultants over the phone. So they're all directors with significant experience, and they can actually help you understand how you could go about protecting the organization, where you need to start, and whom in your organization to speak with, and what points. Now, given that we have a few more minutes, I wanted to mention something else. People always ask me, or they say, "Oh well, I'm fine, I'm good," when we discuss about their cyber resilience, and they say, "I'm fine. Look, I actually took up some cyber insurance policy," and that is almost like saying, "Well, I'm good, I'm protected, I don't need to think about it anymore." In many of our discussions with cyber insurance providers and underwriters, we realized that the policy does not necessarily protect organizations for what they think they are protected. And one of the issues at the moment in the cyber insurance industry is the fact that this industry is very new. Well, you might say, why is it new? Because for the last 10 years, we have been suffering all these attacks, and in particular in the US, they suffered significant attacks, which is true. And it's also true that 9 out of 10 cybersecurity policies are written in the US, and this is like compared to the rest of the world. However, the cyber insurance brokers do not necessarily give you the policy in many cases for the residual risk. So what I'm advising our clients is always to manage the risks internally to the extent that it is possible, and put in place measures that will protect the organization and the board and the employees, and then only take up an insurance policy for the residual risk, for what can't be managed internally. In this way, you actually ensure that if your, as I call it, if your left leg hurts you, you're not getting a pill for your right arm. So you're actually matching the need with what you're going to get from the underwriter. And if you think of actually getting a cyber insurance policy, they will always ask you if you have the basic measures in place. And the basic measures mean, do you have a policy for your passwords? Are you changing them? Do you have an antivirus solution in place? Do you have a business continuity plan? Do you have a risk management system? Is your board involved? And so on. So in the US, there is an association of all the insurance brokers, which actually published some guidelines, and all the members need to abide by them to actually go and start the conversation at the board level. So every time the conversation about cyber has to start at the board level. Why? Because the directors are actually liable. So there's the duty of care that is in common law and in the Corps Act. So I always recommend people go to check Section 180 of the Corps Act if you're under the Corporations Act. And I understand that the majority of the Connecting Up clients are actually subject to, or may be subject to, association acts of different states. Obviously, if you have a presence in more than one state, you need to go by the Corps Act. But also, I would like to suggest that you look at the ACNC, the Australian Commission for Not-for-Profits, that has put in place standards, I believe 4 or 5 standards, that are bridging and trying to get the NFPs closer to the provisions of the Corporations Act. So it's always good to implement best practice and to have a higher level of corporate governance, because ultimately managing risk, managing cyber risk, are actually part of the of any board charter. So back to you, Tina. And if there are any questions.
So there are no questions at this point in time. So did you want to add anything, Monica, before I close this off?
Anyone who would like to contact me via email, please, please go to the previous address, admin@advisoryboardsgroup.com, and we can set up a brief voice conference, a con call, and obviously the winner of the survey, if they wish to be contacted, they will have a longer conversation with me over the phone. So until then, I actually wish you a cyber safe weekend, even if it comes after tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. So thanks very much, Monica, for presenting today. And thank you everyone else for joining us. I hope you have learned a lot from this presentation and that your questions have all been answered. If you do have any questions that come to mind later or any feedback about the webinar, please send that through to events@connectingup.org and we'll answer those questions offline. You can also contact Monica directly with on her contact details on the slide at the moment. Don't forget that the recording will be available within the next few days and a link will be sent to you via email, so keep an eye out on your inbox. Again, thank you all for being with us today and I look forward to seeing you all next time. Thanks.